starting now from the 8th chapter, Perek Shmini, the 8th chapter of Brochos. We're on page 51b, and we are starting fresh from the beginning of the chapter. Elu devarim shebein beis Shammai ubein beis Hillel. These are the things that there is an argument between beis Shammai and beis Hillel, and then the Mishnah gives an extra word, biseuda, with regard to meals. So we have the Mishnah that's going to give us 8 arguments between beis Shammai and beis Hillel regarding a meal. And the Mishnah continues, and it says the first one, beis Shammai yoimrim. Beis Shammai says, Mavarech al hayoim, you recite the bracha on the day, which means on the sanctity of the day. V'yachar kach mavarech al hayayin, and afterwards you recite the bracha on the wine. So you first have the bracha for the sanctity of the day, and then you have the bracha on the wine, according to Beis Shammai. And Beis Hillel says the opposite. Beis Hillel says, Mavarech al hayayin, you recite the bracha on the wine, and afterwards you recite the bracha on the sanctity of the day. And what this means is that when we recite Kiddush Friday night or the night of Yontiv, we recite Kiddush first saying we first say the bracha wine, and then we recite the bracha Mekadesh HaShabbos, or Mekadesh Yisrael B'Hazmanim. First we do the wine, and then we do the bracha on the sanctity of the day. Who are we following? We follow Beis Hillel. But Beis Shammai argues, and Beis Shammai says that we really should do it the opposite. Beis Shammai holds you really are supposed to do the blessing of the sanctity of the day first, and afterwards you would recite the bracha on the wine. So this is an argument Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, and it's regarding what we would call, it's regarding Kiddush, the Friday night Kiddush or the Yontiv Kiddush, and this argument is the first one of 8 that they argue. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue regarding a meal. The second one, Beis Shammai yoimrim noitlim leyodayim. The second argument has to do with the way they used to eat meals in the olden days. In the olden days, there was a certain style, a certain custom that they would enter to a festive meal. And the Gemara earlier, we had a Gemara about it. Ketzad Seder Haseba. The Gemara earlier spoke about the order of how they would recline, and they would go to the one chamber and have wine. Then they would leave that chamber and go into maybe the main ballroom and have the next segment of the meal. And so first they would have wine in one room, then they would go to the next room. And in the next room, Beis Shammai says what they would do would be, they would be noitlim liyodayim, they would wash their hands, v'yachar kach moizgin asakos, and then they would pour the wine and drink it. So they would pour the wine and drink it, and afterwards they would have the bread. So they're washing their hands, interrupting with the blessing on the wine and the drinking of the wine, and then they would do then they would have their hamoitzi. Beis Hillel oimrim, Beis Hillel says moizgim, you first mix the wine, esakos, the cup of wine, v'yachar kach noitlim leyodayim, and only afterwards would you wash your hands. So there's an argument here of how they did the washing. Was the washing done before the wine or after the wine? Now, I am the initial way I translated this is nothing to do with Kiddush. This is the common way they would enter. They would have their festive meal, and whenever they would go to some fancy event, they would have their meal with. First they would have wine, and then they would have the bread. And the way it was done was they would actually, according to Beis Shammai, they would wash their hands first for Netilas Yodayim, and then afterwards they would actually recite a bracha on wine and drink it, and then they would do the challah or the bread or whatever, the rest of the meal. And Beis Hillel says no. You first do you first drink the wine, then afterwards you wash your hands for the Netilas Yodayim for the meal. Now, I did mention yesterday that there is one view that wants to learn this is referring to Kiddush. And according to that, it's actually brings up a custom that's done reminds us of a custom that's done among the German Jews. They actually wash Netilas Yodayim before they sit down. And they wash Netilas Yadayim, then they go to their table and they recite Kiddush, and then afterwards after they drink the wine, they do the Hamotzi immediately without interrupting to go run to the sink, because they washed before they came to the table. And this would be, according to this explanation, this would be following Beis Shammai, but there is it is brought in Shulchan Aruch, such an idea. It's mentioned by the Ramah, and it is commonly practiced in like Washington Heights, where you have the German Jews there's a huge community there of German Jews that live there. They call them the Yekis, and anyway, according to this commentary, this would be Beis Shammai's view that you would wash your hands and then do the Kiddush, and then you would do the Hamotzi. Beis Hillel would argue and say, no, you first recite Kiddush, and then you wash your hands afterwards. Now, the third argument is, it sounds a little funny, like they're dealing with a napkin and where to put it, but it has to do with laws of purity and impurity, and we're going to be studying a little of that, even though it's not the most exciting laws, because we don't find so much practicality of it nowadays. We don't deal with holy foods that we have to be careful of, holies and unholy, but the Mishnah dealt with it, and it's mentioned here. So the Mishnah says, the third argument is Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says, Mekaneach yodav b'mapa, person should wipe their hands after they wash them. They wipe their hands with some type of a towel or a napkin. Umanicha ala shulchan, and they put that napkin on the table. Beis Hillel says al hakeses, on the cushion. So the question is where to place this napkin that maybe is a little wet, and it's either placed on the cushion or on the table, but depending on Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai. The fourth argument is Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says mechabdin es habayis, we sweep the floor of the house, which is if they ate on the floor, they sweep the floor with the room. Bayis sometimes means the room; it doesn't always mean the whole house. So they would sweep the area where they ate. They would sweep it according to Beis Shammai. And afterwards they would wash mayim achronim. So at the end of the meal, according to Beis Shammai, they would actually sweep up, and only afterwards would they do mayim achronim, the water after the meal. Beis Hillel says you first wash mayim achronim, and afterwards they would do the sweep the house. And this we'll see in the Gemara. It has something to do with the food that fell, picking it up, and so on, and making sure not to ruin food. The next argument has to do with Havdalah. And the Gemara is going to be discussing this somewhat length. So let's make sure we get it clear. Beis Shammai says that the order of Havdalah is as follows. Now, I should just add one point, and that is that we're dealing with a person that also has to bench, and he only has one cup of wine. So he wants to do Havdalah. We need to know the order, but he's also combining this cup of wine for Havdalah and for benching. So we need to know how the Havdalah is done and how the benching is done with it. So Beis Shammai says, Ner umazain, that Beis Shammai says that you do Ner mazain b'samim v'havdalah. You do the fire, that's Ner. Mazain is the grace after meal. B'samim, the spices, and then the Havdalah. So he doesn't mention outright the bracha on the wine, but that's obvious that you would do that first. So you do the blessing on the wine, then you would do the fire, then you would do the grace after meal, then you would do the besamim, the spices, and then you do the Havdalah. Beis Hillel says, Ner ubesamim mazain v'havdalah. That you do the ner, the fire, and then the spices, and then the grace after meal, and then the Havdalah. And again, he doesn't mention that the wine was done first. So we didn't mention the wine, but the wine would be first. And what ends up happening is that there's an argument, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, about the middle blessings. Again, both of them begin with the ner, the fire, and they end with the Havdalah, with the blessing, which is the end of Shabbos blessing, which is separating the Shabbos from the weekday. So you begin with the fire, you end with the Havdalah. The question is in the middle, what is the order? So according to Beis Shammai, the order was first grace and then spices. According to Beis Hillel, is first spices and then the grace after meal. Now, this definitely should sound surprising to you. And the reason it should be surprising to you is that we always say the besamim, the spices, before the fire. We do the spices before the boirei mi'orei ha'esh, right? Neither of these views seem to mention that. They both seem to follow a different way of thinking, that the fire comes first. So that is something that we will see in the Gemara, that there is another way of explaining the argument of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. In other words, our Mishnah follows one way of understanding the argument of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, but there is a different view. Our Mishnah follows Reb Meir's understanding of the argument, Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. And then there's another view that says the argument is a little different. That's Reb Yehuda. Reb Yehuda argues in the Gemara. Reb Yehuda says that you got it wrong. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue a little slightly different. And one of them is going to say that you actually do the spices before the fire, like we do. So that would seem that we follow the Reb Yehuda's way, according to Beis Hillel, and not the way our Mishnah has it. So our Mishnah has it, and it is surprising because our Mishnah says that everyone agrees that you do fire before spices. And we know from our houses, from our practice, we do spices before fire. And so I'm explaining that there is a different view in the Gemara. Yes, David.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any reasoning given for one in front of the other, or vice versa.
Well, that's what the whole Gemara is going to be dealing with. That's we got a whole Gemara ahead of us. Okay, so the next argument is about the bracha boirei mi'orei ha'esh. It's about the bracha on the fire. Beis Shammai says, Shebara ma'or ha'esh, he who created the light of the fire, And Beis Hillel says, Boirei, who creates Moirei ha'esh, the lights, plural, of the fire. So as I mentioned yesterday, it seems that there might be two arguments here, because on the one hand, they're arguing, firstly, they're arguing about, is it bara, past tense, or is it boirei, present tense? And then the second thing that it seems that they're arguing about is it one light of the fire, or is it plural lights of the fire? So it sounds from, at least from the Mishnah, that they might be arguing about two separate things. We'll see in the Gemara, that's not exactly, it doesn't seem that the Gemara understands it that way. The Gemara, we'll see in the Gemara. Now, the next statement in the Mishnah mentions that there are certain candles and spices that you cannot recite a bracha on. Ein mavarchin, lo yala ner, v'lo yala b'samim shel akel. You can't recite a bracha on the fire or on the spices of a goy. V'lo yala ner, v'lo yala b'samim shel mesim, not on the fire or on the b'samim that is for a deceased person, which would mean that the fire was lit not for light, and the spices were meant for to deodorize the smell and not for a good smell. So the bracha, you would not recite a bracha on that type of besamim. It's a smell that's meant to remove a negative smell. And you also can't recite a bracha v'layal aner v'layal b'samim shalav zara. You can't recite a bracha for the fire or besamim or spices of idols, of a place where there's idol worship and there's a fire that's lit for the to honor the idol, or for the accessories of the idol and so on. And the besamim, the spices, the incense that's used for that idol, that's lit up for that idol, you cannot recite a bracha on that. It is prohibited to benefit from. You're not allowed to benefit from those things. The Mishnah continues, and it says, "Ve'in mevarchan al haner ad sheyeoisu la'ira." You don't recite a bracha on the fire until you benefit from its light, and we'll see in the Gemara exactly what that means. To what extent do you need to benefit? But the Mishnah says you need to benefit. Mi sha'achal. Here you come to the seventh argument of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, a person who ate food, he forgot, and he did not recite a bracha achreina, and he went and left the place. Beis Shammai says, Yachzor l'makayma, he should return to his place, v'yavarech, and he would recite a bracha achreina, grace after meal. He has to go back to his place where he ate. Beis Hillel says, Yavarech b'makam shenizkar, he recites the bracha where he remembers he does not need to go back to the place where he ate. And the next case, the next point of the Mishnah is, until when can you still recite the after bracha, and when is it too late? Until when can you recite the bracha achreina, the after bracha, ad kadei sheyasachel hamozin shebemeyav, until the food in your stomach is digested. That would be the deadline of how long you could still recite a bracha after eating, and it's not too late. There is a discussion if our Mishnah, when it talks about going back to where you ate, does it apply only to bread? Does it apply to all types of mezainis? Or does it apply to all these 7 species? But however you learn, there is an argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel if a person would need to go back to their place. And or they could bench where they remembered. The Mishnah continues, and it tells us the eighth argument regarding a meal between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Balahem yayin achar hamazon. It was brought to them, it came to them wine after the meal. They didn't bench yet. Im ein sham ela oisei kos, and they only have one cup. So if they drink it now, they will not be able to recite the grace after meal on the cup. Beis Shammai says, make the bracha on the wine and drink it. And afterwards, you can recite the bracha for the grace after meal, and you don't need to have a cup of wine for grace after meal. Beis Hillel says, Beis Hillel says you recite the bracha on the mazon, on the grace, you recite the bracha of grace after meal, and then you save the wine and you have it for the after you finish grace after meal. You recite the grace after meal on this cup of wine, and then you recite the bracha on it and drink it. And the reason is because Beis Hillel says you should drink you should recite Havdalah on a cup of wine. That would be the appropriate way to recite Havdalah on a cup of wine, and not Havdalah, recite a benching. I'm sorry. The proper way is reciting benching on a cup of wine. And Beis Shammai argues. He says, no, you don't need a cup of wine to recite benching. And according to Beis Shammai, it's fine. You can drink it during the meal. At the end of the meal, you finished your food. You want to have some wine, have the wine, and then bench without a cup. Beis Hillel says, no, you got to have a cup. You should have a cup. It's appropriate to have a cup of wine for the benching. Now, the Mishnah concludes and says you do recite Amen if a Jew says a bracha. At the end of the bracha, you say Amen. But for a kuti, which we said was a kutim, are a nation that was brought to Israel after the exile of the 10 tribes. The 10 northern tribes were exiled, and only tribe Judah and Benjamin stayed in Israel. The 10 tribes were exiled at an earlier stage, and Sancheriv exiled them, the king of Ashur, the king of Assyria, and he moved other nations into Israel at the time, mainly from Kuta, and so they were called the Kutim, and they initially were having a lot of problems from the lions, and the lions were eating them up and so on. And they realized that maybe because they weren't worshiping Hashem in the land of Israel, it's much more important. They realized we have to serve the God of the land. And they decided that they should convert. And the question was if their conversion was appropriate or not. And we questioned them. We weren't sure how sincere they were and so on. Ultimately, in the end, we did finalize that they were not properly Jewish, and they were worshiping some type of a form of a dove on top of Mount Gerizim, which they obviously took that idea of Har Gerizim from the blessings that it mentions in the Torah that you're supposed when the Jews went to Israel, they blessed they were given blessings on Har Gerizim and curses on Har Eival. So anyway, they obviously took that idea from there. They were worshiping some type of a idol on Har Gerizim anyway. So in the end, we don't accept their conversion at all. But in the time of the Mishnah, at least according to this view of the Mishnah, we would say Amen to a bracha of a kuti as long as we heard the entire bracha. If we didn't hear the entire bracha, we would have to be concerned that maybe they were mentioning they were saying the bracha to their deity and not to God, and that was a concern, and you therefore would not say Amen for when you hear their bracha.
So that's the first thing they agree on.
Well, it doesn't mention that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel discuss this. It doesn't. The Mishnah mentions it, so it's the author of the Mishnah saying this. So he doesn't say that. He doesn't really talk about. It could be that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel didn't have a discussion even about this.
Right.
So it doesn't emphasize their view on this.
But there is no argument between them that we know.
Right, exactly. That's correct. Okay. The Gemara begins with Tana Rabbanan. The rabbis learned the rabbis. Let me just mute everyone here. No. Okay. The rabbis learned in a brisa, which we explained yesterday is a certain type of brisa called the Tosefta. And the rabbis learned in this brisa, Dvarim, Shebein, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, Besuda. So this is going to be a similar statement to our Mishnah, but it was it's in the form of a brisa. It's a statement of the Tanoim, and it was compiled. In fact, it's in the back of the Gemaras. You have these brisas, and they're called the Toseftas, and they were compiled by Reb Chia, and some say maybe it was written by Reb Yehuda Nasi, and he didn't include it in the Mishnah, but it was I guess his writings, and Reb Chia compiled them together. That's where that's the name Tosefta. It was like additions. It was possibly from Rebbe who had additions to the Mishnah, but a lot of times we find different hints from the brisas and insights from the brisas, arguments from the brisas, explanations of the Mishnah and the brisas. Sometimes the brisas are a little more elaborate. They explain things a little. Sometimes we get little. We find new information. So here the Gemara brings this brisa. Tana Rabbanan, rabbis learn. Devarim shebein Beis Shammai Beis Hillel b'suda. The matters between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel and a meal, meaning that they argue about. Beis Shammai says, Mavarch al hayom. You recite the bracha for the sanctity of the day, and afterwards you recite the bracha on the wine. So that was pretty much, we saw that in the Mishnah, except that this brisa adds a reason for it. Because the day is what causes the wine to come. And the simple understanding is that the day, meaning the holiday, the special sanctity of this holiday, is what's causing you to recite a bracha on wine. Because the day has sanctity, and that's what says, you should really recite a kiddush. Because of that, it would make sense that the main point of the day is the sanctity of the day. And because the day is sanctified, therefore, you need to have wine. Okay, well, which one should come first? Sanctity of the day. Wine is a obligation, an it's a offshoot of the importance of the day. It's an outcome of the importance of the day, but it's not the actual. The main thing is the importance of the day, and an offshoot of that would be that there needs to be wine. So according to Beis Shammai, you should recite the sanctity of the day, and afterwards you recite the bracha on the wine, and then Beis Shammai says Vikvar Kiddush Hayoim, and also it would seem to be another reason. The day has been sanctified for Kodash Hayoim, Va'adayon Yayin Leiba, and the wine is still not here, meaning the sanctity of the day arrives before the wine comes, and because of that, it would come first. The sanctity of the day is first, and the wine comes after. The day is sanctified, you would recite the bracha on the wine, and therefore it would make sense to recite the bracha of Kiddush, which is sanctifying the day, Mekadesh Shabbos first, and afterwards you recite the bracha on the wine. Now, neither of these reasons fit with what we do. What we do doesn't follow this. We do the opposite. We make the bracha, we recite the bracha on the wine first, and then we recite the bracha on the sanctity of the day. But these two reasons would imply it should be done the other way, that you should first recite the bracha on Mekadesh Shabbos, and afterwards you would recite the bracha on the afterwards you recite the bracha on the wine. We mentioned yesterday that there's a commentary that wants to explain why the two reasons of Beis Shammai, they have to do with different scenarios. It's not very simple, but the way he wants to explain it is, what happens if you make Kiddush make kiddush before if you take Shabbos in early, so you recite kiddush early before Yom Tov, before Shabbos. And what happens if you recite kiddush on Challah? So he wants to. One of the commentaries wants to explain that maybe that's why Beis Shammai says both reasons to cover these two scenarios. He says if you recite Kiddush before Shabbos becomes dark, before the day becomes dark, so you do have a scenario where the wine comes first before the sanctity of the day. And in that scenario, he says, you need the other reason of Beis Shammai to explain that the fact is that the day is what causes the wine, even though the wine might come first, but the sanctity of the day is what obligates you to make kiddush, and therefore you have that reason to tell you that even in a case where you accept Shabbos, where you make the kiddush early before it's dark, you would still have to recite Makadesh HaShabbos, the blessing sanctifying the day before the wine. It says in a case where you make kiddush on Challah, so there the Challah is an obligation because it's a Yom Tov, it's a day or a Shabbos. It's a day. The day obligates kiddush. The day obligates the fact that you are obligated to have Challah is not exactly from the sanctification element of the day, but it's part of the holiday obligation of having Challah. So he says, therefore, you wouldn't say that the Yoim, that the day causes, the sanctifying the day causes the Challah, because the holiday itself causes the obligation to have Challah, not the sanctifying of it. Sanctifying of the day it obligates you to do Kiddush, but it doesn't obligate you to do Challah. So it's an interesting thought. There are some questions you could ask on that insight, and one of them is if you recite Kiddush before Shabbos, that doesn't mean that the sanctity you didn't come first. Seemingly the sanctity of the day came first before your Kiddush. So it would seem to me that even in a case where you make Kiddush before Shabbos, the sanctity, you accept it on yourself, the sanctity before Shabbos, it becomes sanctified. And therefore, you could say the sanctity comes first and the Kiddush, the wine, comes afterwards, even according to that. Obviously, this commentary is learning a little differently. He's saying that the day isn't sanctified yet, but the prohibitions of Shabbos is what you're accepting on yourself, but not the sanctity. That's what it seems like the way he's learning. I'm just sharing with you this insight. It is mentioned in the Tzlach. The Tzlach was a halachic opinion that's brought in Shulchan Aruch. He wrote a sefer called the Noida B'Yehuda, Responsa, and so on, and he explains it. He explains this way. So it gives us a little insight into how he understood the Kiddush and the acceptance of Shabbos early. That the acceptance of Shabbos, it seems like the way he's understanding it is that when you accept Shabbos early, the day is not actually, it's not holy already. It's just the prohibitions start, but the holiness comes later. And therefore he could explain it the way he does. Yes, David.
Is the sanctification of the day referring to the davening, the Marav davening, where he refers by Chula Shemayim V'Aretz V'Chol Tzavam? Is it referring to that, or is it referring to the actual day being sanctified when it just comes in? It's sanctified automatically, or is it referring to the person's sanctification by his prayers?
Right. So the simple understanding that I initially learned is that it's the actual sanctity of the holiday, which either comes, at least the way I learned it, is it either comes because the day begins, the Shabbos day has began, nothing to do with you, or if you accept Shabbos early, I would think that sanctity comes on your, like in a certain sense, you've accepted that sanctity already. So you have the sanctity, at least in your spiritual, the spiritual Shabbos has arrived for you.
Rabbi?
Spirituality. But
so
at least the way this commentary is learning, it would come it would only come on when the day arrives. That's when the sanctity of Shabbos arrives, is by in other words, your acceptance of Shabbos, I guess, doesn't really bring in that sanctity. It just brings in prohibitions of Shabbos, and the sanctity really only arrives later. So that would be one point. Then the only other thing is, according to the way he's explaining that, if you make kiddush on challah, so he says there the day isn't causing the challah. You have to understand how that works, because you would think that the sanctity of the day does cause you to have to eat a meal, right? So why is he saying that if you make kiddush on challah, the sanctity of the day doesn't cause challah? It sounds like maybe along what David was saying, that the sanctification of your words are not what obligates the challah. So that would make it sound like it means the sanctification that your recital, your acceptance is, in other words, your sanctification is obligating the wine, because if you say kiddush, you need by sanctifying the Shabbos, reciting the Shabbos, that obligates you to have wine, but it doesn't obligate you to have the challah, because the challah would be an obligation anyway because of the sanctity of the day. So it does sound maybe like the way this commentary is learning is a little connected to the sanctification that you are reciting, your recital. Anyway, it's not the simple way of learning. It's one commentary mentions this, so it does touch upon that. And the simple understanding is the way I mentioned it, that Beis Shammai just gives two reasons, and they both apply in all scenarios. That would be the simple way of understanding. Okay, we're going to continue. Beis Hillel.
Rabbi?
Yes.
When we say the Kiddush, Yom HaShishi Vaychalu Hashemayim Ba'aretz V'chol Spam Vaychol, so on, you would think that the Yom HaShishi, there's more emphasis placed on the day instead of on the ayin, you know what I'm saying? But it includes that, you know what I'm saying? But it seems as though there's more emphasis placed on the day, Yom HaShishi, that's why the tefillah, the kiddush that we say is more, there's more emphasis on that, you know what I'm saying?
So definitely right. There definitely is, if you think about comparing the two, the sanctity of the day.
Otherwise, it would have included, it would have just had, the tefillah would be more based on just the ayin, but it talks about the day. It starts off with the day,
Right. So, bottom line is that, you got a point that the wine, according to Beis Shammai, the wine is secondary. The main thing is the day is what's causing the obligation of having wine, and also the day begins right at the initial beginning. Now Beis Hillel, we're going back to the Gemara now. Beis Hillel says Mevarach al hayayin v'ach kach mevarach al hayom. Beis Hillel argues, and he says no, you first recite the bracha on the wine, and then you recite the bracha on the sanctity of the day. And the question is why? And the Brisa gives an explanation. It gives two explanations. And it says, Shahayayin Gairim Lakadusha Shetayamar. The wine causes that the holiness of the day is mentioned. If you didn't have wine, you would not be mentioning the holiness of the day and in this Kiddush. So if you look at this Kiddush, what is the purpose of this Kiddush? The purpose of this Kiddush is really the wine. You already said the other Kiddush in your davening. This Kiddush, the purpose of it is in order to say Kiddush on wine. It's in order to do it with the wine. The wine is the main thing. If not for the wine, you would not be reciting this Kiddush. So the wine is what's causing this Kiddush to be recited. And then Beis Hillel says, Davar Acher, in another point, is Birchas Hayayin Tadira. Uberchas hayoim eina tadira. The blessing on the wine is often, and the blessing on the day is not often. And because the blessing on the wine is more often, because you do it at ceremonies, the blessing on wine is done. The obligation of blessings on wine is done benchings, ceremonies, weddings, the kiddushes. So it's much more than the blessing on the day of Shabbos or Yontiv. So it's tadir v'sheinu tadir when you have something that's often, something that's not so often. Tadir kaidam, you always do the bracha that's more often, and therefore you should recite the bracha on the. You would recite the bracha on the wine first. So there are two reasons, according to Beis Hillel, why the wine should be the first. Why the wine is first. V'halacha k'divrei Beis Hillel, and the Brisa concludes. The Tosefta ends off and says the halacha follows Beis Hillel. So the Gemara asks, "My davar acher." What does it mean that another explanation? They give an additional explanation for their reason. Why do they need this additional explanation? If you want to say that we follow, if you want to say that maybe we should follow Beis Shammai because he has two reasons and we only have one. So maybe, two reasons is better than one. Here also there are two reasons, Beis Hillel says. You have the concept of what's more usual, often, and the wine is more often than the blessing, sanctification of the day. Therefore, you have the second reason that the usual thing should come first, and therefore we shouldn't follow Beis Shammai, and then and therefore Beis Hillel gives both reasons because he wants you to realize, or the purpose of the second reason is to counterbalance Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai had two, so he also has two. Now, so we don't say Beis Shammai wins, but the question is, so who wins? So then the Brisa concludes, and it says, and the Gemara is going to discuss this, V'halacha k'divrei Beis Hillel, and the halacha follows like Beis Hillel says, and the Gemara discusses this. Pshita, isn't that obvious that the halacha follows Beis Hillel? The Hanafka Baskoil, because we have another Gemara that talks about a heavenly voice that called out that the halacha follows Beis Hillel. So, which itself is an interesting Gemara. The Gemara there discusses that for 3 years they argued Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, and each of them said the halacha follows us. Beis Shammai, the yeshiva of Shammai, all of the followers, they said the halacha follows us, and Beis Hillel said no, the halacha follows us. So for 3 years they argued, and a heavenly voice came out and said, Elu v'yelu, these and these are divrei Elokim Chayim, are the words of the living God, and you're both right, but the halacha follows Beis Hillel. Now, what's interesting is that the Gemara over there has a whole discussion, and it mentions that really Beis Hillel had more people, and Beis Shammai was actually sharper than Beis Hillel. So on the one hand, the halacha should follow Beis Hillel because they're more. On the other hand, the halacha should follow Beis Shammai because they were smarter, right? And in the end, the conclusion was that the heavenly voice came out and said the halacha follows Beis Hillel. And what that means is that we follow the majority, even in case where the minority is smarter, or at least in this scenario, where the minority is smarter, we follow Beis Hillel. So that's the conclusion. So the reason why do we follow Beis Hillel? And the Gemara there says because they were more anvisanin, they were more humble. Why? How do we know they were more humble? They were more humble because they used to mention Beis Shammai's view before their own. So in a certain sense, it doesn't really clarify what would the halacha generally be, if you have majority, that's not as smart, and the minority that's smarter, there's additional elements to this discussion, and one is that Beis Hillel was more humble, and therefore they were, and you have the fact that the heavenly voice came out and announced that the halacha should follow Beis Hillel. So what comes out is that the halacha definitely follows Beis Hillel, but it's only you just need to add those few points that, number one, they're more humble. Number two, the heavenly voice came out. Yes, Ezra.
Okay, I have a question on translation.
Yeah.
On Beit Hillel says She'ayayin golem likdusha. Could you translate that or explain that again?
The wine it causes the sanctification of Kiddush, or the blessing of the Kiddush, the blessing of the Kiddush blessing that sanctifies the day, the holiday. So the wine is the cause of that bracha. If not for the wine, you would not be reciting that whole bracha of Mekadesh Shabbos or Mekadesh Yisrael V'Azmanim. So the wine causes that kedusha. Doesn't mean it causes the holiness, but it means it causes the blessing about that holiness.
Rabbi, can you perhaps elaborate on the source of the heavenly voice and why that's so decisive?
Yeah, just one second. Let me just go back to Ezra. Ezra, I just want you to know that the word after the kedusha has to be included in that sentence. So you have to say Shehayayin Gerim LeKedusha Shetei Omar, and that makes it more understandable. The wine causes that the kedusha is mentioned, is recited. So it's not that it's causing the holiness; it's causing that the holiness is recited, meaning that you mention this bracha of holiness. So you got to add that word Shetei Omar to the sentence. Okay. Now, Yisrael, you wanted to know about that Gemara in Eruvin. Let's pull it up then. The Gemara in Eruvin here. We can just pull it right up over here, and let's actually read the Gemara there. There. Okay, let me share screen and you can see it. I just got to find the where we are over here. Let's see. Share screen. Okay. I think that should work. Does everyone see this? Amar Rebbe Abba. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So Rebbe Abba says in the name of Shmuel, Shalosh Shanim Nechluku Beishami Beis Hillel. 3 years they argued, Beishami Beis Hillel, Halaloim Halacha K'Beisenu, Halaloim Halacha K'Beisenu. He said Halacha should be like us, and those said the Halacha should be like us. Yotza Baskel V'Amra, Elu V'Elu Divrei L'Kim Chayim. A heavenly voice called out, these and these are words of the living God. Halacha K'Beis Hillel, and the Halacha follows Beis Hillel. So the Gemara asks, if the words of both are the words of the living God, why is the halacha? Why did Beis Hillel merit? And the way they translated is neichen, they were pleasant, agreeable. They used the word agreeable and forbearing. And they would teach both their statements and the statements of Beis Shammai. Not only that, but they would even prioritize the statements of Beis Shammai to their own statements and, so to speak, give them honor. And then it gives an example over here, and where they would teach where they would teach the teachings of Beis Shammai before them. L'lamedcha, and then the Gemara concludes. It says it teaches you that shekol mashbel atzmai Hakadosh Baruch Hu magbiya. It teaches you that anyone who humbles himself, Hashem elevates him. V'chol magbiya atzmai, and anyone who makes themselves big, Hakadosh Baruch Hu mashpila, Hashem lowers them. Kol machazer ala gedula, whoever runs after greatness, gedula beirachas bimenu, the greatness runs away. Kol beirach mena gedula, whoever runs away from greatness, gedula machazeras acharav, the greatness runs after them. And so that's basically the Gemara over there, and the commentaries mention about the fact that it was majority, that Beis Hillel did have the majority, but that wouldn't have worked because they were machadadi tfei, unless the Gemara says that. Let me just take a look here. Yeah. So the fact that it was there are these other 2 points have to be mentioned, that the Beis Shammai was more sharp, and Beis Hillel did have the majority. Okay, let me stop the share. So you have what's interesting is that the halacha does follow Beis Hillel, even though Beis Shammai, you would think, well, they're smarter. You would think maybe the halacha should follow them, right? Because we got to get the right shot, but it doesn't work that way. The both shots, both interpretations are correct. The one that's sharper, the one that isn't. And the halacha follows the one that's more humble. And that really teaches you that even if a person's not so smart, they're able to learn Torah and even get the halacha, can follow them. The interesting thing about this debate is, what does it mean? Each one said the halacha should follow us. So one of the commentaries, Teres Chaim and Rabbi Yosef Engel also, they both explain. They have an interesting insight over here. They say that it was the whole issue was, the fact is, each Beis Hillel seemed to have a very clear claim. They said, listen, we have majority. The halacha follows the majority on a simple level. That the halacha should follow the Beis Hillel, right? But Beis Shammai claimed no. It's what does majority mean? There's majority in quantity and there's majority in quality. And if we have the depth, if we go deeper than you go, so we have the majority of depth. So the quantity, you might be right that you have majority, you have more students, but we have quantity, we have in quality, we have more number. Our numbers are bigger in quality, because we have a better quality. So this was a debate between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, is if the halacha should follow the numbers of people or it should follow the amount of depth. And therefore they argued and said, no, we also have the majority. Beis Shammai said, we have the majority, because we might not have majority of people. It's a brilliant idea. And at least understanding, and that's why that was what the argument was, that each one claimed the halacha should be like us, not because they wanted the halacha, they claimed that this is the majority. And anyway, the heavenly voice called out and said the halacha follows Beis Hillel. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say the Bat calls picked Hillel because Hillel considered Shammai first and came up with their nusach. But Beit Shammai is coming up saying, we are better, but now he starts considering Beit Hillel. He didn't consider Beit Hillel before they made their decision.
I don't know if they considered them even afterwards.
No, it sounds like, now they are talking about it. But before they didn't consider Beit Hillel, and because Bet Hillel did consider Bet Shammai already, that's why the Bat Kol picked them.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'm not sure how you see that Beis Shammai like
I
now
see
has.
it that Bet Hillel said, in the whatever you were reading now, they argued for 3 years,
Yeah.
but that's afterwards. It was not before they gave their opinion. But we
Yeah, but
know
how do you
that
see the other way?
But we know that Bet Hillel always lists Bet Shammai before they give their opinion. They
Right.
list Bet Shammai's opinion.
No, that I
Means
understand.
they consider it
Yeah,
and still
no,
give their opinion.
Yeah, and they put theirs first. But the
Right.
question is the opposite way. How do you see Beis Shammai in the end like caved in?
Well, no, the Beit Shammai didn't consider Bet Hillel before they gave their opinion. They
And
only
afterwards?
come and complain to, about Bet Hillel having the majority,
Uh-huh.
but they don't even consider that Bet Hillel considered their idea, but they didn't consider Bet Hillel's idea before they made their opinion.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Yes, Mordechai.
Yes, also, there's something that says that even though they differed on all these, nevertheless, they didn't refrain from marrying with each other.
They did or didn't?
Did not refrain, that they
Uh-huh.
still married each other even though
Right.
they had different opinions.
Different opinions, right. Eza hi machloikas shi l'shem shamayim, zu machloikas Hillel b'Shammai. Right? There was an argument that's l'shem shamayim. That's an argument between Hillel and Shammai. Okay, so the Gemara concludes over here and says, why would we need to say halacha to Beis Hillel? There's a baskol. So Yisema koydem baskol. So some say you could say, if you want, say that this statement that the Brisa says that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, this statement was before that baskol came out, and before the 3 years were up. So at the end of the 3 years, the baskol came out. So this happened before the end of the 3 years that the Brisa was learned, and it was mentioned that the halacha follows Beis Hillel, and B'Bayisema lacher baskol. And if you want, say that happened after the baskol. And now we turn to page 52a, where Rabbi Yoshua, and this follows Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Yoshua says, the Amar who says, Ein mashkichem bebaskol, we do not paskin like a baskol, because Torah is loy bashamayim, Torah is not in heaven, and therefore we do not follow the heavenly voice. According to Beis Hillel, according to Rabbi Yeshua says this. He was talking about this stove that we once studied about, how Rabbi Eliezer held one way, and he tried to prove it with a baskol, a heavenly voice, and the Rabbi Yeshua got up and said the heavenly voice doesn't do anything, it doesn't change the halacha, and even though he had a voice calling out from heaven, what the halacha is, Yeshua says, what does that do? Just shows you're holy and you're a scholar. It doesn't mean that the halacha follows it. And so he says Torah loy b'shamayim. So therefore, our Brisa Sefta says clearly the halacha follows Beis Hillel in this scenario. Okay, we're gonna stop here. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye-bye.